December 1193. A fleet of ships prepared to sail from the coast of Suffolk.
You've got probably about 500 to 1,000 people going.
It was the worst time of year to cross the English Channel.
It's a substantial diplomatic mission apart from anything else.
They were led by a woman, the former Queen of France, now Dowager Queen of England, and its de facto ruler, Eleanor of Aquitaine.
She is coming up to 70, so she's very much in her late 60s.
For Eleanor, this mission was not just political, but personal. Her sixth child was King Richard I, known as the Lionheart. He was travelling back from the Holy Land when he was captured by his enemies. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor was demanding a colossal ransom for Richard's release. Eleanor was determined to free him.
The journey encompasses first collecting the ransom, because the ransom was utterly enormous. And she had to spend quite a lot of time going around the country, kind of begging and cheerleading and getting people to dig out their favourite chalices and their little stores of gold and so forth to get this enormous ransom together in these big boxes.
Eleanor wasn't only asking for vast sums of money.
She also had to persuade large numbers of people within the aristocracy of England to actually send members of their family to be hostages for Richard. Not a particularly attractive sell.
So Eleanor embarked on a hostile sea in the middle of winter with 200 hostages and half the treasure of England. She arrived in the city of Speyer in January 1194. The fate of her son and of the English crown was in Eleanor's hands. Not for the first time, nor the last. It was down to her to make history. For BBC Radio 4, this is History's Heroes. People with purpose, brave ideas, and the courage to stand alone. I'm Alex von Tunzelmann, and I've long been fascinated by the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine. She held extraordinary power in her own right, as well as through her husbands and sons. She was married to 2 kings and had 10 children, 3 of whom became kings and 2 queens. Despite tremendous setbacks, Eleanor played the medieval Game of Thrones better than most, sorting out disaster after disaster for the often chaotic men in her life.
My parents wanted me to do a job which earned some money. And since I am one of those people who's forever asking questions, being a lawyer was actually quite a good job to do.
Sarah Cockrell is a High Court judge turned historian. She's the author of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and England, Mother of Empires.
Law and history are real close cousins. They both involve evaluating evidence, working out which evidence to trust, and making decisions about, answers to questions based on that.
Eleanor has long been romanticised by poets, writers, and historians. She was played by another of our history's heroes, Katharine Hepburn, in one of my favourite films of all time, A Lion in Winter.
She's often seen as a kind of kick-ass feminist icon. She routinely tops the sort of polls for the most exciting medieval figure. Lots of people still name their daughters Eleanor in honour of her, and there's a reason for that. She is a groundbreaking figure and a very inspiring figure, and also as a woman who really found power in her middle years.
But it can be hard to find the real Eleanor. She was the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine.
It was a family which was full of fantastic personalities, including her grandfather, who was reputed to be the first of the troubadours, a man of, great elan, poeticism and power.
But her father had no surviving sons. He died when she was around 13, and she became Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. That made her one of the richest women in Europe. The King of France quickly married her to his 17-year-old son, Louis.
The only sensible marriage for her was with Louis VII of France, who was just being crowned as the young king in France.
Just days later, the old king died. His son became King Louis VII of France, and Eleanor became queen.
So, age 13, she becomes Queen of France, married to a lovely, handsome, completely feeble young man who had wanted to become a monk and was a terrible husband.
Louis and Eleanor had 2 daughters together and travelled to the Holy Land on a crusade. But while they were away, their marriage began to falter.
During the course of it, she decides that she no longer wants to be married to him. That leads to all sorts of ructions and stories about whether she had had an affair with somebody, possibly even her own uncle.
Eleanor was around 26, and gossiping courtiers believed she was then unlikely to produce a son. The marriage was annulled. As a single woman, Eleanor was ruler of Aquitaine, but her great wealth made her vulnerable. It would belong to any man she married. So there was a huge incentive for men on the make to kidnap her and force her to marry them. In fact, she escaped 2 attempts to do exactly that. She needed the security of another marriage, and one she'd chosen. Quickly, she proposed to her ex-husband's arch-rival, Henry of Anjou, Duke of Normandy.
The only other sensible option is to marry young Henry of Anjou, who has a good claim to the English throne.
Henry was about a decade younger than her. He gladly accepted. Louis was furious. Within 2 years, Eleanor's new husband became King Henry II of England. Once again, she was a queen. She and Henry had 8 children, including 5 sons, really proving those gossiping courtiers wrong. Henry and Eleanor were a remarkable medieval power couple, but their marriage was tempestuous. Henry was often unfaithful. Meanwhile, as their children grew up, they began to plot against their father.
Her sons ended up rebelling against Henry II.
Those sons, including Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey and John, grew up to plot against each other as well as their father.
One of the brickbats which is often thrown at Eleanor is she must have been such a terrible mother because her sons were always fighting.
Henry the Young King was handsome and a skilled jouster.
But not a good manager of money and not good at getting on with his dad.
Richard would be a crusader. Geoffrey became Duke of Brittany by marrying another heiress. And then there was John.
Yes. Well, John is interesting. John is very, very young when Eleanor goes into captivity. He's probably about 6-7 years old.
When her sons rebelled against her husband, Eleanor had to make a choice.
Eleanor had at some point to decide whether she was going to support her husband or her sons. She chose her sons.
To go against her husband, the king, was treason. Eleanor left him and went to Poitiers, back in Aquitaine. She was around the age of 50 in 1173 when the rebellion against her husband began to collapse. Henry imprisoned his wife in various castles under a form of house arrest.
Locking up the woman who has the right to more than half of his land is not a dumb thing to do.
He had to be careful, though. She was a powerful enemy.
You have to think of Eleanor as not just a person, but she is the key to a whole lot of his power. And to let her be free, once he had lost trust in her, that would be an unbelievably stupid thing to do. She was jolly lucky he didn't kill her.
July 1183. Eleanor was around 60. For the last decade, she'd been her husband's prisoner. She was now at Sarum, a settlement near what's now Salisbury. That's where she was told that her oldest son, Henry the Young King, had died of dysentery. He was 28 years old. His dying wish was for his mother to be treated kindly by his father, King Henry II. But in any case, Henry was now behaving somewhat more charitably towards his wife.
The relationship between them, I think, had softened somewhat in the last years. He did allow her to see her family in the later years. He did allow her to visit France briefly in the early 1180s. She probably saw him at some point around then. And at the end of the day, they had raised a family together.
Over the next few years, Henry and Eleanor attempted to negotiate with each other. Their son Geoffrey also died, aged 27, in Paris. This left just two warring sons, Richard and John. Henry arranged for Richard to marry Alice of Vexin, sister of King Philip II of France. It would be a powerful alliance. Alice was only a child at the time of the betrothal and was sent to England as Henry's ward. As she grew up, though, Henry grew rather fond of her himself. Perhaps too fond. The rumours were he started to have an affair with her. Richard had already rebelled against his father, Henry. If Henry was now also having an affair with his fiancée, that would hardly have helped their relationship. Henry made little secret of the fact that anyway he preferred his younger son, John. In his 50s, Henry's health began to fail. The final shock came when he learnt that John had joined Richard, and both of them were going to ally with Philip II of France against him. This news finished him off. King Henry II died, aged 56. Richard now became King Richard I of England, the Lionheart. Richard had also inherited much of western France. He was 32 years old and not yet married. He couldn't rule all the lands from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees by himself. And so, aged around 65, his mother Eleanor became queen again and the effective ruler of England.
She made all the arrangements for Richard's coronation. He basically just turns up and she tells him where to stand. She commissioned the music for it. She organised the robes.
It's thought that Eleanor may have encouraged Richard to ask the Pope to free the hostages who stood in for him.
There was certainly a resonance for Eleanor as somebody who had been a prisoner, for her to say, well, I'm freed, let's let some other people experience freedom at the same time as a sign of the joy that Richard's reign is going to bring.
She set out to reform trade across their empire by standardising weights, measures and coinage.
It's just one of those economic fundamentals.
At the time, many people used local currencies and measures, but this meant it was awkward for traders to take their goods further afield in the realm.
Whereas if you're standardising measures, you can have people coming to different markets from all around the country and knowing, that a bale is this much and the standard strength of liquor is this.
King Richard had little interest in such technical policy making. More than anything, he wanted to go on a crusade. He hoped to take Jerusalem from the Muslims for the glory of Christianity. Again, he turned to his mother for help.
She helps Richard with getting the money together for his crusade. She goes on quite a lot of the visits that he makes when he is in England to talk to people about getting the provisions together for the crusade.
With Richard departing on the crusade and the question of his marriage still unsettled, there were more family problems brewing. Eleanor's youngest son, John, was now telling everyone in England that he was the next king.
John was married to a major landholder in England. He had spent a lot of his childhood in England, so he had quite a power base there. And he had the real capacity to destabilise Richard's ability to rule while he was away.
Richard wanted to banish John from England, but Eleanor persuaded him to trust his brother and let him stay.
John, of course, betrayed the trust which was placed in him and did try and incite people to rise against Richard while he was away.
Meanwhile, Richard got out of his engagement to Alice of Vexin. In Cyprus, on his way to the Holy Land, he married a Spanish princess, Berengaria of Navarre. Back in England, it was becoming increasingly hard for Eleanor to keep the peace, especially because Richard just kept making enemies. He offended Duke Leopold V of Austria by tearing down his standard from the walls of Acre. He also squabbled with Philip II of France, partly because he'd broken off that engagement to his sister and married somebody else.
One of the fallouts led to Philip, King of France, going back to France. And one of them was a dispute about who took certain prisoners or booty from one of the battles that they were in.
Richard won several victories in the Holy Land, but he failed to take Jerusalem for Christianity. Crossing the Adriatic on his voyage home, Richard was shipwrecked. This meant he had to travel on the much more dangerous land route across Europe. On the way,
he fell into the power of somebody who didn't like him and who thought, fine, I'm going to take you prisoner. And the person who took him prisoner then sold him to the emperor.
His captor was Duke Leopold of Austria, the man whose standard he'd torn down at Acre. Leopold handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who wanted to ransom him back to England for an enormous sum of money.
150,000 marks, I think, that they finally settled on, with a down payment of 70,000. And then you've got a load of hostages, these 200 hostages from English and Norman families. It's a vast, vast sum.
So vast that Eleanor had real trouble raising it. Richard hadn't spent much time in England. Most people didn't know him and weren't entirely sure why they should pay.
Reputedly, Eleanor had sort of travelled around the country with Richard's crusading kit, which had made its way back without him, to say, this is what Richard was doing. He was crusading. He was fighting for right in the Holy Land, and he was captured on his way back, and this is what it's all in aid of, a thoroughly good cause.
After an exhausting campaign to gather funds and a long, cold journey, Eleanor arrived in Speyer. From there, she travelled on to Mainz, where she learned that the emperor was coming up with even more demands.
Although the amount of the ransom had been agreed, the emperor was still being a little opaque about whether there'd be further terms.
Then, as usual, the family drama started up. Eleanor learned that her younger son John was plotting with Philip II of France to pay the emperor to keep Richard imprisoned. Her boys were bickering again.
There were offers coming in from Philip of France, with John encouraging Philip of France, essentially bidding against Richard, saying, if you keep him prisoner, we'll give you even more money than he's prepared to give you.
Luckily for Eleanor, the emperor rejected Philip and John's offer. He released Richard to her.
The emperor, having more or less said, 200 hostages, vast amount of money, and I'll let you go, turns around and says, 200 hostages, vast amount of money, and oh yes, you've got to do homage to me.
Eleanor knew that to do homage, Richard would have to kneel at the feet of the emperor and swear his loyalty. It was a demonstration of power, designed to humiliate her proud son.
The question of homage was a toxic point between the kings of England and the kings of France for many years.
It seemed like the whole deal might fall apart.
That was humiliating, that was incredibly difficult. The sources suggest that Richard was going to say no.
Eleanor told Richard to swallow his pride.
Eleanor persuaded him, just suck it up, do what has to be done. You can always renege on the deal later, but do that from a position of freedom rather than staying here.
Against all the odds, Eleanor had raised the money, negotiated, seen off rivals, and freed her son.
And then who but his mother could have persuaded Richard to make that final sacrifice of pride?
Richard thanked his mother for saving his life and his kingdom. He was free, but he still had to deal with his brother. Eleanor hoped for peace between them.
She gets Richard home. She has to engineer a reconciliation between Richard and John, because as you can imagine, they are not best pleased with each other.
Richard forgave John. He went to France to defend his lands against the incursions of King Philip II. Finally, with all this done, Eleanor felt she could rest.
Then she does actually take some time. It's what I call her mini retirement.
In her early 70s, Eleanor moved to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou. It was where her husband, Henry II, was buried.
She was thinking of being buried there herself.
Then she heard that Richard was in peril again.
Richard is on campaign. He is dealing with difficult people in the Limoges region, which has always been a difficult area. She hears that he has been gravely wounded.
Richard was hit in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound became gangrenous.
She receives the message that he is about 100 miles away and on the verge of death. And could she please get there, if at all possible?
The only way to get there on time was on horseback.
By the time she arrived, either he would have been delirious or have sunk beyond actually talking to anybody. She was there at least in time to catch his last breath. I mean, a terrible thing. She had not long since seen her daughter die in agony as a result of a childbed gone wrong. And then to see her brilliant, successful son, who she had rescued not that long before, die in agony again. Appalling.
Though he'd married, Richard had no legitimate children. He'd named his brother John his heir. But there was another challenger, their late brother Geoffrey's son, now known as Arthur, Duke of Brittany. Arthur was only 12, but he could be considered to come before John in the line of succession. With Eleanor's help, John was able to build a coalition of support in England.
There is a kind of appearance to it that they had a letter from Eleanor saying, this is the way to go.
But in France, there was strong support for Arthur. Philip II of France supported him in a rebellion. In 1202, the 15-year-old Arthur besieged his own grandmother. Eleanor was at the Chateau Mirabeau when he attacked.
The army of France and Brittany comes and lays siege to the castle.
She sent word to John.
He is miles away, absolutely miles away.
Arthur's troops advanced with ease, but Eleanor refused to surrender. In fact, she was rather irritated by it all.
And she berates Arthur for being a terrible grandchild.
The army paid no attention to this scolding.
They kind of celebrate the fact that they've more or less taken the castle and they're bound to take it the next day.
Uncharacteristically, John came to his mother's rescue.
John, in his only distinguished bit of battle work, manages to do a forced march, comes on the French army from behind, devastates it, and takes Arthur of Brittany prisoner, thereby solving the succession problem. He then has to decide what to do with Arthur.
John took Arthur prisoner. What happened next has remained a mystery.
Arthur is later acknowledged to be dead. Did somebody feel it would be helpful to kill Arthur to please John? Maybe. Did John authorise the killing of Arthur? Maybe. Did John actually kill him himself, as some people say? Maybe. Nobody will ever know the truth.
Now John had no rival. Eleanor continued to work in his interest.
She also spent a lot of time in the early days of John's rule going round her territory. She did a really big circuit of her territory, which at her age was a big ask. Actually talking to her vassals, giving them grants, bringing them on side to John's rule.
Though Eleanor supported him, John was a disaster as king. He was cruel and ruthless. He lost most of his French lands to Philip of France, rinsed England for taxes, and alienated the nobility, who rebelled and forced him to sign Magna Carta. Despite all his shortcomings, though, Eleanor continued to support her only remaining son.
She's been operating at this level for many years. She has huge status by virtue of being really old in days when really not a lot of people get to be really old. Having been queen of 2 countries, having done so much and lived so much, she is a living legend. And she's in a position to throw that into the equation to help her children, always to help her children.
Eleanor died aged about 80 in 1204.
I'm afraid that her last days she must have thought, it's all going to hell in a handcart. And I have got nothing left to give. I can't do any more. I've done everything I can.
The empire that she and Henry II had fought for was in tatters.
But there is one little glimmer there that I think she must have taken away with great satisfaction. She had seeded in the heart of France one of her descendants who would change the face of French history.
Many of Eleanor's grandchildren and great-grandchildren went on to rule parts of Europe, but one in particular might have given her satisfaction. Her daughter, also known as Eleanor, married King Alfonso VIII of Castile, and their daughter, Blanche, Eleanor's granddaughter, married King Louis VIII of France. Their son was King Louis IX, Eleanor's great-grandson. He became one of the greatest kings of France, with Blanche as his close advisor. He was famed for bringing his people justice, order, and great wealth.
I mean, long term, Eleanor's greater success comes from her daughters and granddaughters who achieve much and are credited with very little, whereas we hear a lot about the sons, and they are maybe not long term so successful.
Eleanor of Aquitaine lived a life that helped define medieval Europe, and right until the end, she never gave up.
I found her ability to not be made hard by the difficulties and challenges that she encountered really, really inspiring.